Not all musical forms are based on how one can order and develop musical motifs or themes. Sometimes classical music forms are based on types of folk or court dances that made their way into concert music. These dance forms each have a different rhythmic trait, meter, and structure. In this video, I will be outlining just one of those dance forms. The Polonaise was one of the more popular dances of the 19th century. It originated as a court dance at the end of the 16th century in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and was often danced during Carnival. The Polonaise is a type of circle dance. For those wondering what a circle dance is, I think it should be self-explanatory from these visual examples. As for the traits of the music that accompanied the dancers, the following stylistic markers need to be understood. The Polonaise is moderate in tempo, written in 3/4 time, and should have a dignified and majestic feeling to it. As for the rhythmic traits of the Polonaise, it is marked by a rather simple exchange of 8th notes and 16th notes. This rhythm is often held steady by the accompaniment, while the melody is somewhat free to explore over the rhythmic mold. A simple example of this is found in Beethoven's Polonaise in C, Opus 89, where the bass voice of the piano lays out the characteristic rhythm of the Polonaise, over which Beethoven writes a simple but rhythmically opposing melody. The melody here does not necessarily constitute a Polonaise melody, but once the typical rhythmic pattern of the Polonaise is added to it, voila, it's a Polonaise. And this essentially makes the rhythmic characteristic of a Polonaise the deciding factor. Without this accompanying rhythm, the piece is just a moderately paced piece in 3/4 time. This can also be reversed when the melody takes on the rhythmic characteristics of a Polonaise, as seen in Ziere's Fächer Polonaise. A more refined way of composing the Polonaise comes from Chopin's Heroic Polonaise. In this example, Chopin implies the typical Polonaise rhythm with both the melody and the bass accompaniment. Before we continue, one more common characteristic of the Polonaise is that the musical phrases often end on an unstressed beat. So in 3/4 time, this would be the second or the third beat. Obviously, it is not necessary or recommended to keep the boilerplate Polonaise rhythm going non-stop throughout a Polonaise, but it is still necessary to somehow keep the feeling of the Polonaise going. So how can a composer achieve this if the typical Polonaise rhythm is absent? One way of doing this is by repeating this small part of the Polonaise rhythm often, as this is essentially the smallest repeatable aspect of a Polonaise. We can see this in action in Chopin's Polonaise, Opus 26. Although this fundamental rhythm is by far the most common rhythm found in Polonaises, it isn't the only acceptable Polonaise rhythm. It is always possible to play around with the fundamental rhythm a little without destroying the integrity of the Polonaise's rhythm. Finally, if one were to go about writing a Polonaise, how should the entire piece be structured? The usual rule of thumb is some version of ternary form. There are many different versions of ternary form, but the basic rule of thumb is an A section followed by a differing B section, which then returns to the initial A section. So let's imagine we were to go about writing a Polonaise. The most common and established way of going about it would be to strongly present the characteristic Polonaise rhythm in the A section. In the B section, it is common practice for the composer to opt for a differing, smoother, and often calmer characteristic. And to close the piece, we bring the listener right back to the initial A theme. Of course, you can adopt aspects of the Polonaise to whichever form you want, such as writing a Polonaise within the scherzo or rondo form, or maybe you want to add a short little introduction before the Polonaise begins in earnest, as Chopin often did. Or perhaps even you simply want to add the Polonaise rhythm into a completely different piece. It's basically up to you. And that's where a lot of the fun in working with and understanding musical forms lies.